Welcome to worship today at Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Sierra Vista, Arizona. I'm Reverend Tina Squire, and I am the facilitator of today's service. I want to introduce to you the other members who have made this worship possible. I give great thanks to Doreen Oberg, a resident of Sierra Vista who teaches at Cochise College and played us into worship with a prelude she wrote herself. It's called I'm Always Yours. Doreen will also play an offertory and a postlude at the end of worship. I want to thank Rich Wilder, a member of this church, who also spends much of his year in Rochester, New York, but is still with us and able to lead us in 2 songs today. And I want to thank Wallace Hoggett, who will share his Easter message, Little Betrayals Everywhere. For the past 3 weeks, we have been joining forces with the 3 other Unitarian communities in Southern Arizona. The 4 of us make up the Baja 4. There is an additional Baja 4 worship today, but because Wally had already signed up to speak, I wanted to make it possible for him to do so. And so we have our own separate worship as well. We have some announcements for the life of the church, because even though we are not meeting together that often in physical space, we are gathering online. Every Sunday, of course, you can find our worship on YouTube, but you can also come to our social hour at 11:30 on Zoom. There's another social hour Thursdays at 11:30. And in between on Wednesdays, we meditate with Rich and Gail Wilder at 10 a.m. Look for all those links in our newsletter and pay attention to our newsletter and special announcements to find out what's going on in the life of this church. Once a month, on the first Friday of the month, we have gathered to go hiking, and Molly Anderson has led us. We've kept 6 feet of distance and kept our group to 10 or under, and we may have additional hikes to get out to be together in a safe way. Today, I want to remind you that even though we can't collect the offering in the usual way, we still need to keep the life of the church going, and we need to support our emergency assistance fund. So pay attention to the slide about the offering while Doreen plays the offertory later in the service. I'm not going to remind you to turn off your cell phones because frankly, I can't hear them and it won't offend Wally, but I hope you're here in body and mind and spirit as we gather across space together. And because we have not been able to do our usual first Sunday gathering, today I invite you to read out loud as Wally leads us in saying our covenant of right relations.
We, the congregation of Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Church, covenant to treat all beings with compassion and kindness, listen actively and speak responsibly, seek understanding and be open to change, acknowledge our imperfections and our differences with good humor, devote our energies to creating and maintaining a vibrant, beloved community among ourselves and in the greater world.
As we light our chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism, I invite you to find a chalice or a candle, or just imagine you're doing it with me at home. I'm going to read some words for you, written by the Reverend Rod Richards, who is the first minister here at Sky Island. He served here from 2003 to 2012, and since then he's been serving the Unitarian Universalists of San Luis Obispo in California. And he wrote, "Stay together and stick together. We who gather here in this tender and anxious time, we have been awash in a sea of information and misinformation and disinformation, and this information that we seek is simply so that we may make wise decisions about how we respond and learn how we hold one another when we can't hold one another, and decide how we can be when we can't be together. What is this that we face? How best do we respond? And why is this happening? The why, the why, the why. And why do those who suffer so suffer most, always suffer most from what we now face? Why? And what can we do for those who are most at risk, most vulnerable, all the time, now and again? And how do we respond? And how do we hold one another when we can't hold one another? And how do we stay together and stick together and worship together when we can't be together? Yet we are. Here we are. We are here together. Today, our special song leader, Rich Wilder, will now lead us in our welcoming song.
Good morning. I'm Rich Wilder, and I'm a member of Sky Island Unitarian Church, and I'm going to lead you in singing of a great Easter hymn. I'll start with a short introduction. Joy dawned again on Easter Day. The sun shone out in fair array. Alleluia, alleluia. Fair rising morning, praise rejoice. High stars of evening find a voice. Oh, sing ye, oh, sing ye. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. Swift rushing wind so loud and strong, white clouds that sailed in heaven along. Alleluia, alleluia. The burning sun with golden beam, the silver moon with softer gleam. Oh, sing, oh, sing. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. cool flowing water, pure and clear. Make music for all life to hear. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Dance, flame of fire so strong and bright, and bless us with your warm light. Oh, sing, oh, sing. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
At Sky Island, we are a warm and welcoming congregation, and we'd like to hold the joys and the sorrows of each person here. Though we cannot name them out loud to each other across the airwaves today, I want you to hold them and hold space for them. As I throw a stone from my son's geode collection into this bowl, I hope that you will think of your joys and your sorrows, and that you will find a way to share them with us in the social hours we will hold in the weeks to come. But I honor you, and I lift up all that is heavy and joyous in your hearts. Today, I want to throw a special and large and beautiful stone in as I honor the memory of Jan Anderson, who died earlier this week and whose presence in this church left a ripple that was large and loving and creative and giving and thoughtful and irreplaceable. I want us to take a moment to think of Jan. And I'm going to close this time of meditation with some fragments by a poem called Surface Tension by the Reverend Tess Baumberger. In nature, surface tension gathers water molecules together so tightly that they form a sort of membrane across which light things can dance: leaves, insects, the wavering sun. Bitter tannins in chartreuse mosses increase the tension so larger drops can form, held aloft by their fragile villi until they can be absorbed or used to foster new life. In this pandemic, people are reaching out in kindness and concern to acquaintances, neighbors, strangers, creating aquifers, revealing watersheds, running through the tiny capillaries of human hearts, minds, homes, streets, and neighborhoods. Could the bitter tannins cause such large drops to form that we could scarcely hold them up until they can be absorbed, until we can use them to foster life? Let us open ourselves wide to gather them so that we may send them to the suffering, the grieving, the caregivers, and all the workers who always were essential. Let us send them across all those spurious divisions, because there is a deeper, humbler, more beautiful truth. We deeply need one another, especially now. We can pull together across distances to form a surface across which things can dance and which can nurture life. Hear these words from Psalm 22 as translated by Robert Alter. These are the first few verses of the psalm that Jesus started to recite on the cross in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my rescue are the words that I roar. My God, I call out by day, and you do not answer. By night, no stillness for me. And you, the Holy One, enthroned in Israel's praise, in you did our fathers trust. They trusted, and you set them free. To you they cried out and escaped. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and no man, a disgrace among men, by the people reviled. All who see me do mock me. They curl their lips, they shake their head.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Easter. I've got a reading now which is sort of unusual as a reading for Easter Sunday. Frankly, it would be unusual as a reading for pretty much any Sunday, but here it is. These are the lyrics to the song Pancho and Lefty. Now, the song is familiar to many people primarily because of the Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard version of the song that came out quite a few years ago. But it's also been covered by a wide range of other artists such as Rosanne Cash and Emmylou Harris and Steve Earle and many, many others. It was written by Townes Van Zandt, who was a singer-songwriter who died on January 1st, 1997 at the age of 52. The song first was published in 1972. In Pancho and Lefty, many of the precise facts about the two characters within the song are left deliberately obscure. You can get into heated arguments online and in person if you want to, concerning exactly what is going on in the story that's the subject of the song. But I think that the most obvious interpretation is the correct one, and that is it's a song about two bandits, one of whom betrays the other one and then has to live with the consequences of that betrayal into his old age. Now, depending on what artist is recording the song, you can hear some minor variations in the lyrics of the song. These lyrics that I'm going to share with you are those as sung by Townes Van Zandt himself. Living on the road, my friend, was gonna keep you free and clean. Now you wear your skin like iron, your breath's as hard as kerosene. You weren't your mama's only boy, but her favorite one, it seems. She began to cry when you said goodbye and sank into your dreams. Pancho was a bandit, boys, his horse as fast as polished steel. He wore his gun outside his pants for all the honest world to feel. Pancho met his match, you know, on the deserts down in Mexico. And nobody heard his dying words, but that's the way it goes. And all the federales say they could have had him any day. They only let him hang around out of kindness, I suppose. Lefty, he can't sing the blues all night long like he used to. The dust that Pancho bit down south ended up in Lefty's mouth. The day they laid poor Pancho low, Lefty split for Ohio. Where he got the bread to go, there ain't nobody knows. All the federales say they could have had him any day. They only let him slip away out of kindness, I suppose. The poets tell how Pancho fell and Lefty's living in a cheap hotel. The desert's quiet and Cleveland's cold, and so the story ends, we're told. Pancho needs your prayers, it's true, but save a few for Lefty too. He just did what he had to do, and now he's growing old. A few gray federales say they could have had him any day. They only let him go so wrong out of kindness, I suppose. Good morning again, everyone, and happy Easter again, everyone. Now, you don't need me to tell you that we're all celebrating Easter in bizarre and dismal times. And that's why I'm addressing all of you by means of a computer screen as opposed to live and in person in the sanctuary of the church. And by the way, I don't normally wear a tie around my house, but I did put a tie on just for all of you. So that tells you how special I regard all of you. I'm not going to talk to you, though, about the topic that seems to consume everyone during these times. And namely, I'm not going to talk to you about the coronavirus and how it's changing and has changed all of our lives and how it's going to change everything into the future. It's going to change work. It's going to change social interaction. It's going to change religious services. It's going to change everything. I'm not going to talk to you about those things today because that would require a greater degree of confidence in my own ability to predict the future than I now feel. I don't have that degree of confidence. If you want to find out about these things, you're going to have to attend services, say, at the high church of CNN or perhaps the low church of Fox News. That's entirely up to you. But for today, I want to talk about something else. Not something that has changed and will change on account of coronavirus, but something that is innate within human beings themselves, which has not changed over time, which probably never will change, and that is our capacity for betrayal of our fellow human beings. And that is illustrated nowhere so well as in the story of Easter, and even more particularly, the events leading up to Easter. Now, I can't tell you what did or did not happen on the original Easter Sunday 2,000 years ago. I don't have a time machine to go back and find out for myself, but even without a Wayback Machine to find out exactly what happened in first century Palestine, there are a few things that I think we can say with fairly good assurance about that first Easter. One of the things that we can say is that there could not have been an Easter Sunday without there first having been a Good Friday, and also that there could not have been a Good Friday without numerous acts of betrayal that were perpetrated by many of Jesus' followers. Those betrayals were betrayals of Jesus by them. Betrayal is woven into the very fabric of Good Friday and, as a consequence, of Easter itself. One of Jesus' inner circle took money to turn him into the police. Another one of the inner circle denied 3 times that he even knew who Jesus was. And seemingly the rest of the male disciples of Jesus took to their heels and ran away after he was arrested. They abandoned him to his fate. And by the way, these cowards seemingly were only the men, the male followers of Jesus. It does not appear as though the female followers of Jesus, and there were many of those. It does not appear that they took to flight to get away from the scene of his arrest. Only the men were the cowards. Now, I am inclined to believe pretty much the gospel accounts of betrayal and denial and abandonment. I'm inclined to believe that those stories are true. Because if you were writing a gospel intended to put Jesus in a favorable light, you probably would not, out of whole cloth, create a story showing that Jesus was bad at picking an inner circle. But these accounts of betrayal and denial and abandonment certainly show that his inner circle was not vetted particularly well in terms of ensuring their fortitude in the face of adversity. Now, of course, the Gospels were written with underlying theological themes, including themes such as, well, these things had to happen. Jesus had to be turned over to the authorities. He had to be betrayed. He had to be executed. But the need that the gospel authors felt to explain the story in that way is evidence that those underlying facts of betrayal and denial and abandonment are actually true. You wouldn't feel that you are required to come up with a theological explanation for an embarrassing fact unless that embarrassing fact had actually happened. Jesus' betrayer in chief was, of course, the infamous Judas. Now, of course, there have been numerous efforts over time to try to rehabilitate Judas's public image, and that goes back to a late 2nd century non-canonical work called the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, and such efforts continue through a 20th century novel by Nikos Kazantzakis called The Last Temptation of Christ. And such works tend to portray Judas as doing basically what Jesus wanted him to do. And so he's really not the villain according to these works that popular culture tends to consider him as being. But those works pretty much represent a decidedly minority view. Really, the smart historical money is on the more traditional image of Judas. He was a traitor. Judas betrayed Jesus on more than one occasion. Now, it's common to think of Judas having betrayed Jesus the one time, but really more than once. And if you believe Matthew's gospel, there were 3 separate times. Now, 3 out of the 4 gospels, all of them except the Gospel of John, have it that Judas went to the high priests and made a deal to betray Jesus. Now, this was the first betrayal. And of course, everybody knows that 3rd betrayal that occurred in the Garden of Gethsemane on Thursday night when Judas identified Jesus for the police who came to arrest him. All 4 of the Gospels have that one, although John leaves out the kiss. The other 3 Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, they all show Judas betraying Jesus by means of a kiss. But only Matthew, only the Gospel of Matthew reveals the 2nd betrayal. Whereas the Gospels of Mark and Luke relate the scene in which Judas talked to the high priests about betraying Jesus, they describe, Luke and Mark that is, they describe the high priests as simply agreeing to pay Judas the money for betraying Jesus. Presumably, this agreement to pay him the money in actuality would go into effect after Jesus was handed over. But in the Gospel of Matthew, the chief priests actually pay Judas right then and there on the spot. They pay him in advance. And that's not just a slip of the pen for Matthew. It is something that not only fits in with his version of the story, it's actually necessary to an important part of the story as Matthew tells it. In Matthew's gospel, after Jesus was handed over and was condemned, Judas then went to the high priest in the temple with his 30 pieces of silver, and he threw the silver back at the priests in the temple in an unsuccessful attempt to repent for what he had done. And he must already have received the silver as of that time in order to throw it back at the high priests. So it was a necessary part of Matthew's account, his gospel account, that Judas be paid in advance. Now, in Matthew's version of the gospel, the payment in advance, Judas's obtaining the money in advance of the betrayal, that creates an opportunity for Judas's second act of betrayal. What was that second act? Well, having been paid already, Judas went through with the plan anyway. Since Judas had already received the silver, he could have skipped town without betraying Jesus. Or better yet, he could have called a meeting of the 12. Judas could have done this. Hey guys, everybody, want you to know something. I did go to the temple and I betrayed Jesus to the high priest for 30 pieces of silver. But before you get mad, let me tell you, they gave me the money already. They gave it to me in advance. Here it is. And guess what? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to follow through on that. And by the way, do you know what else? Every one of you here can go and do the same thing. Just go there, tell them you're going to betray Jesus, get the money and come back. Then we can all skip town before they figure out that they've been conned. Now, in Matthew's gospel, after Judas took the priest's money, he had a choice. Either betray Jesus or betray the priests. And sometimes, if you've already betrayed your friends to your enemies, you might be able to square it up again, or at least some of it, by then betraying your enemies back to your friends. But that isn't what happened. Judas betrayed Jesus a second time by not betraying the priests. The three betrayals by Judas match up with the three denials by Peter. You remember that? After Jesus was arrested, he was taken to the high priest. The particular circumstances vary from gospel to gospel, but anyway, he's taken to the high priest, and Peter followed at a distance. He ended up in the courtyard of the high priest, or maybe it was the courtyard of the high priest's father-in-law. The Gospels don't agree on this point, but anyway, he followed along to wherever it was that Jesus was taken. And while in the courtyard, he was accused, correctly so, of having been a follower of Jesus. Peter denied it. He denied it once, then he denied it twice, then he denied it 3 times. And then he heard the rooster crow, and he went out and he wept bitterly, as one of the Gospels says. He wept bitterly because he realized that he, just like Judas, had betrayed Jesus. Jesus had reportedly predicted Peter's denials, although maybe the prediction was invented to soften the impact of such treason committed by Jesus' top lieutenant. But the denials themselves, the fact that Peter issued those denials, that fact is simply too embarrassing to the Jesus movement not to have been true. Jesus, I think we can assume, felt betrayed by, well, everybody. He felt betrayed by everyone he thought had supported him. There was, of course, Judas, and of course, Jesus being where he was at the time, he wouldn't have known about Peter's denial, but if you accept the gospel story, he predicted that. And of course, he saw after he was arrested, all of his male followers took to flight. He also felt betrayed not only by his followers, but also by God. Yes, he did. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's the King James Version. The version that was read this morning is in the more colloquial, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the first line of Psalm 22, which was one of our readings. And on the cross, Jesus quoted that line, and it was only that line. That's the first line of Psalm 22. Only that line did Jesus quote. That was the line accusing God of forsaking him. Now, to forsake is to abandon. To abandon is to give up on. To forsake is to betray. Now, Psalm 22, as you move along within the text, starts sounding more conventionally appropriate, indicating that, yes, God will be steadfast and will support his followers, including the narrator of the psalm. But early on in the early portion, in the portion that constituted our reading this morning, that's not the way the psalm comes across. The psalm comes across as, you, God, betrayed me. There were other people you upheld. You were faithful towards other people, but to me, you weren't supportive. You didn't help me. You didn't protect me. Why have you betrayed me? Why have you betrayed me? Now, I suspect that quite a lot of us have felt betrayed at times. I suspect that a lot of us have, in fact, betrayed other people. With soft voices and in dark rooms with nobody watching, many of us would confess to having betrayed people close to us. Maybe we've convinced ourselves that, our betrayals were on small matters, just little betrayals here, little betrayals there, little betrayals everywhere. But small betrayals tend to consolidate together to make something larger, oftentimes much larger, just as small fires tend to merge into one big fire. Little fires everywhere become one huge conflagration. How to respond to the twin truths that we've been betrayed and that we have betrayed others. How are we supposed to deal with that? Well, what happened in other cases? It's often helpful to look at the precedents, so to speak, to look at how other people have dealt with the realization that they have in fact been traitors to others and that they in fact have been betrayed by others. Look at other cases. According to Matthew, Judas, remember him, the traitor in chief, Judas hanged himself after he threw the money back at the priests. Now, in the book of Acts, which is basically volume 2 of the Gospel of Luke, that tells a different story, one in which Judas bought a field with his payoff from the high priest, but he fell headlong on the property and his bowels burst open and he died. In both of those stories, the one from Matthew and the one from Acts, the second volume of Luke, Judas died without ever effectively coming to terms with his betrayal of Jesus. And then there's Lefty from the other reading for this morning. Lefty, who just did what he had to do when he betrayed Pancho. Lefty spending his time in a cheap hotel in Cleveland. Lefty no longer singing the blues. Lefty with the dust that Pancho bit down south in his mouth. Lefty, who in common with Pancho needs your prayers. It's true, he never came to terms with his betrayal of Pancho. That's, I think, one of the major tragedies about the story contained in that song. But there's Peter. There's Peter. Peter, the one who denied Jesus 3 times. There's a story in John's Gospel that I want to talk to you about. Now, did it happen the way that John says it did? Probably not. John's Gospel is the latest in time of the 4 Gospels. That is, it's the most removed in time from the events described therein. And also, John's Gospel is the one that is least tethered to the ideal of literal truth. I mean, think about it. John's Gospel is the one that begins, in the beginning was the Word. Well, that's kind of hard to verify one way or the other as a matter of historical fact. And John's Gospel isn't primarily interested in whether the things that are recounted in that Gospel are literally true or not. But here's the story I want to share with you. It's sort of an Easter story. Now, it doesn't occur on Easter Sunday, but it is in John's Gospel a post-resurrection story. It occurs after Easter when the disciples, according to John's Gospel, many of the disciples at least, were in Galilee, far removed from Jerusalem. And this story is about Peter and his encounter with the resurrected Jesus. It's in the last chapter of John. In this translation, this is the one made by Richmond Latimer. Let me read it to you. When they had breakfasted, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Take care of my little sheep." He said to him for the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because he had asked him for the third time, "Do you love him? Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my little sheep." Now, before the crucifixion, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. And after the resurrection, according to John, Jesus asked Peter 3 times to affirm him. And to affirm him not merely with words, not even primarily with words. Peter tried to do that. Peter tried to affirm Jesus solely with words. Lord, you know. Lord, you know that I love you. But Jesus insisted on something more. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my little sheep. Now, one thing I can tell you is I am quite certain that nobody listening to this expected to hear Contract Law 101 during this Easter message, but here goes. For any contract to be enforceable in a court of law, in an Anglo-American court that is, there must be first an offer by one party and second an acceptance of that offer by another party. Many contracts, in fact, most contracts, can be made when there's an offer and there is then an acceptance of that offer merely by words. If the offer is, I will sell you my car for $5,000, you can make a contract with me by saying, that's a deal. That is a binding agreement. And you don't even have to have the money in your pocket or in your checkbook, and you certainly don't have to hand that over. You simply create for yourself an obligation to pay the money. But there are certain kinds of offers that may be accepted, if at all, only by performance. Only by performance. If the offer is, I will pay a reward of such and such a princely sum to the first person who develops an effective coronavirus vaccine. That's the offer. Princely sum of such and such an amount. First person who develops an effective coronavirus vaccine. That's the offer. That is one that can be accepted only by performance. That is, by developing the vaccine. A mere promise to do that isn't good enough. It doesn't make a contract. It is not a valid acceptance of that offer. Now, in this story from the last chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus insisted on performance. Jesus insisted that's the only way you're going to accept, in effect, what is sort of an offer of forgiveness. You can attach whatever interpretation you want, but the only way that you can meet my approval is by performance. Little acts of service, little acts of grace. Such things help form the cure for all kinds of betrayals, those we have committed against others and those that have been committed against us. Feed those who must be fed, care for those who need to be cared for. Now, I have to tell you, I do not believe, as a matter of empirical fact, that Jesus rose from the dead the way John describes it and had this conversation with Peter after breakfast that John says happened. I don't believe that John intended for us to think of that story in that way. rather than putting forward a story that supposedly we were supposed to accept as being literally true, I think what John was doing was telling us how to recover from betrayal, our own betrayal of others or the betrayals of others committed against us. There are little betrayals everywhere. That's the bad news. That will always be the bad news. Little betrayals everywhere. But the good news, and this will always be the good news, there are little acts of forgiveness, little graces everywhere, and they are all around us. Happy Easter, everybody.
Now let there be an offering out of our abundance to sustain this gathering and to strengthen the work that grows from our commitment to each other and to the world. And now Richard Wilder will lead us in our closing song.
And now let us join in singing, All People That on Earth Do Dwell. I'll play a short introduction. Here we go, joyfully singing. All people that on earth do dwell, sing ye aloud with cheerful voice. Let hearts exultation swell. Come now together and rejoice. Oh, welcome in this day of praise. Approach with joy your God unto. Give thanks and faith proclaim always. For it is seemly so to do. Ring the rafters. For we believe that life is good. Love doth abide forevermore. Truth firmer than our rawest word, and shall from its old age endure.
Before I read to you today's closing words, I want to encourage you to practice the way of hope, to remember that life will find a way, that love can never be fully vanquished. And as Wally reminds us, betrayal does not have to have the final word. Little acts of redemption are possible anywhere and everywhere. Our closing words come from the Reverend Joel Miller, who has served congregations in Canton and Buffalo, New York, Corvallis, Oregon, Littleton, Colorado, and most recently served as the interim senior minister at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York, the Wilder's other church. Hear these words. We all know loss and pain. Let none of it divide us. In the rising sun today, let us do together what we cannot do alone. Roll away the stones that close our hearts. And now Doreen will lead us out in hopeful Easter music. And afterwards, even if you stay put, I hope you will go in a spirit of love and justice. Go in peace and go in beauty.